She came to a land that forgot how to sing, carrying only a suitcase and a heart full of secrets. But in the quiet of a stranger's home, could she find the one thing she'd never dared to hope for? A place to belong? The horizon stretched, wide and unforgiving, a canvas of ochre and amber painted across the Arizona plains. It was 1887, and the sun was a relentless guest, pouring its golden weight over the scrublands where mesquite clung to life like a whispered prayer. A weathered stagecoach rattled along a dirt trail, its wheels groaning as they carved shallow ruts into the earth. Dust swirled in its wake, rising like ghosts that refused to settle. Inside the coach, Iris McKe sat alone, her hands clasped tightly around a worn leather satchel. Her dress, a soft gray muslin faded by time, bore the faint scent of lavender from a sachet she kept tucked in her pocket, a relic from a life she no longer claimed. Her hair, a cascade of chestnut curls, was pinned loosely beneath a simple bonnet, and her eyes, the color of storm clouds before rain, stared out the window. They were eyes that had seen too many farewells, too many doors closed before she could knock. At 26, Iris carried the weight of a woman who'd learned to walk softly, to speak only when spoken to, and to leave before anyone asked her to stay. She wasn't from Arizona. Her accent, soft and rounded, hinted at the green hills of Virginia, a place she'd left behind when her father's debts swallowed their home. Since then she'd drifted, sewing in Kansas, washing linens in Missouri, cooking for miners in Colorado. Each job ended the same: a kind word, a small payment, and a suggestion to move on. A woman alone in the West was a shadow, seen but rarely welcomed. Yet Iris had learned to carry her solitude like a shield, her satchel, her only constant companion. The stagecoach driver, a grizzled man named Amos, had barely spoken since picking her up in Tucson. "You sure about this, miss?" he'd asked when she showed him the crumpled flyer. "Boone's place ain't exactly a palace." Iris had only nodded, her lips pressed into a line. The flyer, torn from a mercantile board, read, "Cook wanted, remote homestead, meals for one, room provided. Inquire at Willow Creek." It wasn't a promise, just a possibility, and Iris had long since stopped believing in promises. As the coach crested a low hill, the homestead came into view. It was less a house than a collection of stubborn structures, defying the wind. The main building, a low adobe with a sagging porch, stood flanked by a corral empty of horses and a shed, leaning like a drunkard against a cottonwood tree. A single windmill spun lazily, its blades creaking in the dry air. The place looked like it had been built by hope and abandoned by time. The coach lurched to a stop and Iris stepped out, her boots sinking into the parched earth. The air smelled of sage and sun-baked clay. She smoothed her dress, adjusted her bonnet, and waited as Amos tossed her satchel down. "Good luck, miss," he said, tipping his hat before cracking the reins. The coach rumbled away, leaving her alone with the silence. Iris stood still, her gaze sweeping over the homestead. It wasn't fear that held her there, but a question. Can I start again? She'd asked it in every town, every boarding house, every dusty road. The answer was always the same: not yet. But something about this place, with its cracked walls and quiet defiance, felt different. It felt like a mirror. The door to the adobe creaked open and a man stepped onto the porch. Thatcher Boon was tall, with shoulders broad enough to carry the weight of the world and eyes that seemed to have forgotten how to trust it. His shirt, a faded blue cotton, was tucked neatly into trousers worn thin at the knees, and his boots bore the scars of countless miles. His face, weathered by sun and sorrow, held no warmth, only a quiet intensity that made Iris lower her gaze instinctively. "You Iris?" His voice was low, rough, like gravel underfoot. "Yes, sir," she replied, lifting her chin just enough to meet his eyes. Her voice was steady, though her hands tightened around the satchel. He studied her, his brow furrowing as if she were a puzzle he hadn't expected to solve. "Kitchen's inside. You'll sleep in the back room. I don't need talk, just meals." He paused, then added, "You cook?" "I can manage," Iris said softly. Biscuits, stew, whatever you need. Thatcher nodded once, then turned, leaving the door open behind him. It wasn't an invitation, but it was enough. Iris picked up her satchel and followed, her steps deliberate as if testing the ground for cracks. The interior of the house was sparse. A wooden table, a single chair, a hearth cold with disuse. The air carried the faint must of neglect, as if no one had lived here in years, only survived. She set her satchel by the back room's narrow cot and glanced out the small window. The sun was slipping behind the hills, painting the sky in hues of apricot and indigo. Somewhere in the distance a hawk cried, its call sharp against the gathering dusk. Iris closed her eyes, letting the sound anchor her. She'd been a stranger before. She could be one again. But as she lit the stove and began to knead dough for the morning's bread, a whisper of something unfamiliar stirred in her chest. It wasn't hope. Not yet. But a quiet defiance. A refusal to let this place be just another stop on a road to nowhere. She didn't know it then, but the silence she brought with her was already weaving itself into the fabric of this broken home. And Thatcher Boon, a man who thought he'd buried his heart long ago, was listening. What would happen when two souls scarred by loss found solace in the spaces between words? The Arizona dawn broke gently, like a sigh held too long. Light spilled over the adobe homestead, painting its cracked walls in shades of rose and gold. Inside, Iris McKe was already awake, her fingers deftly stirring a pot of porridge over the wood stove. The air carried the faint sweetness of oats and a hint of sage from the bundle she'd hung by the window. Her gray muslin dress was pinned up at the sleeves and a single curl had escaped her bonnet, brushing her cheek as she worked. The kitchen, though sparse, felt alive under her touch, cleaner, warmer, as if it remembered what it meant to be a home. Iris moved with quiet purpose, her boots soft against the packed earth floor. She'd been at the homestead for 3 days, and already she'd found a rhythm. Rise before the sun, light the stove, bake bread, scrub the hearth. It wasn't the work that tethered her. It was the silence. Not the heavy kind that suffocated, but the kind that listened, that waited. She'd known too many places where silence was a warning. Here, it felt like a companion. Outside, Thatcher Boon was mending a fence post, his hammer striking wood with steady precision. His blue cotton shirt clung to his back, damp with the morning's labor, and his hat cast a shadow over eyes that rarely softened. He was a man of few words, his world bound by routine. Tend the land, check the windmill, sit on the porch at dusk with a tin cup of coffee. The homestead was all he had left after the fever took his wife, Clara, 3 years ago. He'd let the place go quiet after that, not out of choice, but because he didn't know how to fill it again. Iris brought a plate of biscuits and a bowl of porridge to the table, setting them down with a faint clink. Thatcher came in, wiping his hands on a rag, and sat without a word. His gaze flickered to the food, then to her, brief but searching. "Smells good," he muttered, the closest thing to a compliment he'd offered. "Thank you," Iris said, her voice soft but clear. She didn't linger, turning back to the stove to pour herself a cup of tea. She'd learned early not to expect conversation from men like Thatcher, men who carried their grief like a stone in their pocket, always there, always heavy. But as she sipped her tea by the window, she noticed something. A small wooden box on the shelf, half hidden behind a sack of flour. It was carved with simple vines, the kind of thing a woman might cherish. She didn't touch it, but her eyes lingered, wondering who it had belonged to, what stories it held. The thought stirred a memory of her own. A silver locket her mother had given her, sold long ago to pay for a train ticket west. Iris pushed the memory down, focusing instead on the steam curling from her cup. That afternoon she ventured beyond the kitchen, her curiosity pulling her to the small garden patch behind the house. It was little more than a square of dry earth, choked with weeds and bordered by a crumbling stone wall. She knelt, her fingers brushing the soil, and for a moment she imagined it green, rows of beans maybe, or a cluster of sunflowers nodding in the breeze. The thought made her chest ache, not with sadness but with a longing she hadn't allowed herself in years. She didn't hear Thatcher approach until his shadow fell across her. "Ain't much to work with," he said, his voice low. He stood a few feet away, one hand resting on the wall, his hat tipped back to reveal a face lined with questions he didn't ask. Iris glanced up, shielding her eyes against the sun. "It could be something," she said, her tone careful but firm. "Just needs a little care." He studied her, his jaw tightening as if her words had struck a nerve. Then he nodded, almost imperceptibly, and walked away. Iris watched him go, her hands still in the dirt, and wondered what it was about this man that made her want to stay, even when every instinct told her to run. That evening, as she washed dishes in a tin basin, she heard a sound, a low, rough hum from the porch. It was Thatcher, sitting with his coffee, his voice barely audible as he murmured an old hymn. The notes were clumsy, like he hadn't sung in years, but they carried a weight that made Iris pause, her hands still in the soapy water. She didn't know the song, but it felt like a confession, a crack in the wall he'd built around himself. She dried her hands and stepped to the doorway, leaning against the frame. The sky was a deep lavender, streaked with clouds that glowed, faintly at the edges. Thatcher didn't look at her, but his humming stopped, and the silence that followed was different. Charged, like the air before a storm. "I didn't mean to interrupt," Iris said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You didn't," he replied, his eyes still on the horizon. He took a sip of coffee, then added, "My wife used to sing that. Said it kept the dark at bay." Iris nodded, her throat tightening. She wanted to ask about the wife, about the box on the shelf, about the emptiness that hung over this place like a shroud. But she didn't. Instead, she said, "It's a good song." Thatcher turned to her then, his gaze steady, searching. For the first time, she saw something in his eyes. Not warmth, not yet, but a flicker of recognition, as if he'd just realized she was more than a cook, more than a stranger passing through. The moment passed and he looked away, but it left a mark, small and indelible, like a seed pressed into the earth. As Iris returned to the kitchen, her heart beat a little faster, not with fear, but with something new, something fragile and unnamed. She glanced at the garden patch through the window, its barren soil bathed in moonlight, and made a silent promise to plant something tomorrow, no matter how small. What would it mean to take root in a place that had forgotten how to grow? The Arizona sun climbed high, its heat pressing against the adobe walls like a heavy hand. A week had passed since McKe arrived at Thatcher Boon's homestead, and the rhythm of her days had settled into something steady, like the heartbeat of the land itself. Each morning she rose with the dawn, her hands coaxing life from the kitchen, cornbread golden and warm, coffee thick enough to wake the weary, a pot of beans simmering with the last of the dried chilies. The house, once a husk of forgotten dreams, began to hum with her presence. Curtains aired out, floors swept clean, a jar of wild lupines on the table catching the light. Iris stood in the garden patch now, her bonnet pushed back, a smudge of dirt across her cheek. The soil was stubborn, cracked from years of neglect, but she'd spent hours loosening it with a rusted trowel she'd found in the shed. In her apron pocket were a handful of squash seeds, traded from a passing peddler, for a slice of her cornbread. She knelt, pressing each seed into the earth with care, as if planting not just a garden, but a promise. Her gray muslin dress pooled around her, and her chestnut curls glinted in the sunlight, framing a face that held both resolve and quiet wonder. She didn't notice Thatcher watching from the corral, his hands resting on a fence post, his hat tilted low. He'd been checking the windmill's gears, but his eyes kept drifting to her, her deliberate movements, the way she brushed dirt from her hands with a kind of reverence. He didn't understand it, this pull she had, this way of making broken things seem worth saving. His wife Clara had been like that once, filling their home with laughter and plans. But Clara was gone, and Thatcher had buried that part of himself with her, or so he thought. "Iris," he called, his voice cutting through the stillness. She looked up, startled, and stood, brushing her hands on her apron. "You need water for that?" He nodded toward the garden, his tone gruff but not unkind. She hesitated, then nodded. It'd help. The soil's dry as bone. He disappeared into the shed and returned with a dented bucket filled from the well. He set it beside her without a word, his boots scuffing the dirt. Iris murmured a thank you, but he was already turning away, as if staying too long might unravel something he wasn't ready to face. She watched him go, her heart catching on the smallest details. The way his shoulders slumped slightly, the faint limp in his step from an old injury, the care he'd taken to bring her the water. That evening, as the sky burned orange and the air cooled, Iris sat on the porch steps, a chipped mug of tea cradled in her hands. The lupines she'd picked glowed faintly in the dusk, their purple petals a quiet rebellion against the barren land. She hummed softly, an old Virginia lullaby her mother used to sing, its melody weaving through the night like a thread. She didn't hear Thatcher approach until he spoke. "You sing like that often?" His voice was low, almost lost in the breeze. He stood at the edge of the porch, his tin cup of coffee steaming in his hand. Iris froze, her cheeks warming. "Not often," she said, glancing down at her mug. "It's just something from home. Helps me think." He nodded, his eyes on the horizon where the last light clung to the hills. "Clara used to hum too, different songs, but same feeling." He paused, then added, "You don't have to stop." The words were simple, but they landed like a gift. Iris looked at him, searching his face for the man behind the stone exterior. His eyes, usually guarded, held a flicker of something softer. Regret, maybe, or a longing he didn't know how to name. She smiled just a little and resumed her humming, letting the notes drift between them. The next morning, Iris found something unexpected by the kitchen door, a small clay pot, rough but sturdy, filled with fresh soil. Beside it was a folded piece of paper, Thatcher's handwriting uneven but clear. "For your seeds." Found it in the shed. No signature, no flourish, just the quiet offering of a man who spoke louder through actions than words. Iris held the pot, her fingers tracing its edges, and felt a warmth spread through her chest. It wasn't just about the garden. It was about trust, fragile and new, taking root in the space between them. She spent the day planting more seeds, squash in the garden, herbs in the pot. And as she worked, she thought of Virginia, of the apple orchard behind her father's house, where she'd dreamed of a life bigger than the one she'd been given. Those dreams had faded, replaced by survival. But here in this patch of Arizona dirt, she was beginning to dream again, not of grand things, but of small ones. A garden that bloomed, a home that felt hers, a man who might one day look at her and see more than a cook. That night, as she set a plate of cornbread and beans on the table, Thatcher lingered longer than usual. He didn't eat right away, his fingers tapping the edge of his cup. "You ever think about staying somewhere?" he asked, his voice low, almost hesitant. "Not just passing through?" Iris paused, her hands stilling on the dishcloth. She looked at him, her storm cloud eyes steady. "I used to think I didn't belong anywhere," she said. "But I'm starting to wonder if belonging's something you build, not find." He didn't respond, but his gaze held hers for a moment longer than necessary, and in that silence, something shifted, a door cracking open just enough to let a sliver of light through. Iris turned back to the sink, her heart pounding, and Thatcher ate in quiet, the clink of his spoon the only sound in the room. As the stars emerged, sharp and bright against the desert sky, Iris stood by the garden, the clay pot cradled in her arms. She didn't know what lay ahead, but for the first time in years she wasn't afraid of the answer. What would it take for two hearts, bound by loss, to learn the language of staying? The Arizona sky hung heavy with the promise of rain, its clouds rolling in like uninvited guests over the sun-scorched plains. 2 weeks had passed since Iris McKe planted her first seeds, and the homestead was beginning to wear her touch like a well-loved coat. The kitchen glowed with the scent of fresh-baked cornbread, a patchwork quilt she'd mended draped over the back of Thatcher's chair, and the garden patch, once a barren scar, now hinted at life with tiny green sprouts pushing through the earth. Iris stood by the garden, her gray muslin dress dusted with soil, her chestnut curls tucked loosely under a scarf. Her storm-cloud eyes traced the fragile stems, and a quiet smile curved her lips, a smile that felt like a secret she was just beginning to trust. Inside, Thatcher sat at the table, his calloused hands wrapped around a tin mug of coffee. His blue cotton shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, and his hat rested on the table, revealing hair streaked with early gray. He'd been quieter these past days, not out of anger, but as if wrestling with thoughts too heavy to voice. Iris had noticed how he lingered near the kitchen longer, how his eyes followed her when he thought she wasn't looking, how he'd started leaving small things for her, a spool of thread for her sewing, a tin of molasses for her baking, a smooth river, stone placed by the garden, its surface warm from the sun. This morning, as Iris swept the porch, she found another gift, a small leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed but empty, tied with a piece of twine. A note in Thatcher's uneven scrawl read, "For your thoughts." Clara used to write in one like it. Iris held the journal to her chest, her breath catching. It wasn't just a gift, it was an invitation, a crack in the wall he'd built around his heart. She slipped it into her apron pocket, promising herself she'd write in it tonight. Maybe a memory of Virginia, maybe a dream of this place, maybe something she didn't yet have words for. But the calm of the homestead was short-lived. That afternoon, a rider appeared on the horizon, his horse kicking up dust as he approached. Iris was in the kitchen, kneading dough, when she heard the hoofbeats. She wiped her hands and stepped to the door, her heart tightening. Visitors were rare, and in her experience they seldom brought good news. Thatcher was already outside, his posture stiff, one hand resting on the porch rail. The rider, a wiry man with a weathered hat and a tobacco-stained grin, dismounted and tipped his hat. "Name's Caleb," he said, his voice sharp as a blade. "Heard you got a new cook, Boon. Folks in Willow Creek are talking." His eyes slid to Iris, lingering too long, and she felt a chill despite the heat. Thatcher's jaw tightened. "What's your business, Caleb?" Caleb smirked, pulling a folded paper from his vest. "Got a message from a man in Colorado. Says, a woman named Iris McKe ran off with his pay after work in his saloon. Wants her sent back to answer for it." He held out the paper, but Thatcher didn't take it. Iris froze, her hands clenching the doorframe. The air seemed to thicken, pressing against her chest. She'd known this moment might come. The shadow of her past, always one step behind. The saloon job had ended badly, not because she'd stolen, but because the owner had cornered her one night, his hands grabbing what wasn't his. She'd fled with nothing but her satchel and her pride, but truth rarely outran a lie. "That's not true," she said, her voice steady but low. She stepped onto the porch, meeting Caleb's gaze. "I didn't take a dime. I left because I had to." Caleb raised an eyebrow, his grin widening. "That's what they all say, Missy." Thatcher turned to her, his eyes searching, not with doubt, but with a quiet intensity that made her heart race. "You tell me what happened," he said, his voice low, meant only for her. Iris swallowed, her fingers twisting in her apron. "The man in Colorado, he tried to take more than I was willing to give. I pushed him off and ran. He locked me out, kept my wages. I didn't steal anything." Her voice cracked, but she held her chin high, refusing to look away. Thatcher studied her for a long moment, then turned to Caleb. "You've delivered your message. Now get off my land." Caleb chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "Suit yourself, Boon, but folks'll talk. Always do." He mounted his horse and rode off, leaving a trail of dust and unease. Iris stood rooted to the porch, her breath shallow. Thatcher didn't move, his gaze fixed on the horizon where Caleb had disappeared. Finally, he spoke, his voice rough but firm. "I don't care what they say in Willow Creek. You're here now. That's what matters." She looked at him, her eyes stinging with unshed tears. "You believe me?" I've seen enough liars to know you ain't one, he said, his tone matter of fact. He picked up his hat and put it on, then added, Supper smells good. Don't let it burn. Iris nodded, a small laugh escaping her despite the weight in her chest. She returned to the kitchen, her hands trembling as she stirred the beans, but Thatcher's words echoed in her mind, anchoring her. He hadn't asked for details, hadn't judged. For the first time in years, someone had chosen to see her, not her past. That night, she opened the journal and wrote her first entry. Today, I was believed. It feels like standing on solid ground after years of sinking. She closed the book and placed it by her bedside, next to the river stone. Outside, the wind carried the faint scent of rain, and the homestead stood quiet, its walls holding secrets and second chances in equal measure. What would it mean for Iris to trust not just Thatcher but herself in a world that had taught her to run? The Arizona air had softened, the sharp edge of summer giving way to the gentle warmth of early autumn. The homestead stood bathed in morning light, its adobe walls glowing like honey against the backdrop of cottonwood trees, their leaves just beginning to turn gold. Iris McKe knelt in her garden, her fingers brushing the sturdy green vines that had sprouted from her squash seeds. Her gray muslin dress was tucked carefully around her knees, and her chestnut curls, freed from their usual scarf, caught the breeze. The garden was small but thriving, a testament to her patience, a quiet defiance against the desert's indifference. She hummed softly, the same Virginia lullaby from weeks ago, and the sound seemed to weave itself into the morning, as natural as the chirping of sparrows. Inside, Thatcher Boon sat at the kitchen table, his blue cotton shirt rolled up to the elbows. A map of the surrounding trails spread before him. His tin mug of coffee sat untouched, steam curling into the air. Since Caleb's visit, he'd been restless, his eyes scanning the horizon more often as if expecting trouble to ride back unannounced. But it wasn't just Caleb's words that stirred him. It was Iris, her quiet strength, the way she'd turned his house into something alive, the way her presence made him question the walls he'd built around his heart. He'd left her another gift yesterday, a carved wooden hairpin, simple but smooth, placed on the kitchen counter with no note. When he saw her wear it that morning, tucking a curl behind her ear, something in his chest tightened, a feeling he hadn't named since Clara. Iris entered the kitchen, carrying a basket of early squash, their skins a pale green streaked with gold. She set them on the counter, her storm cloud eyes bright with a pride she didn't voice. First harvest, she said, glancing at Thatcher. Thought I'd make a stew tonight. He looked up from the map, his gaze lingering on her. Looks good, he said, his voice low, almost tender. You've got a way with growing things. She smiled, a small unguarded curve of her lips, and turned to the stove. But before she could light it, a sharp crack echoed from outside, a sound like wood snapping under too much weight. Thatcher was on his feet in an instant, his chair scraping the floor. Iris followed him to the door, her heart pounding. Outside, the windmill lay in ruin, its blades splintered, one arm dangling like a broken wing. The well it powered stood silent, its bucket swaying in the breeze. Thatcher cursed under his breath, his hands on his hips as he surveyed the damage. Must have been last night's wind, he said, his voice tight. Without it, we've got no water for the garden, no water for anything. Iris stepped closer, her eyes tracing the wreckage. The garden, her garden, depended on that well. Without it, her sprouts would wither, her small patch of hope reduced to dust. But it was Thatcher's face that struck her most. Not anger, but a weariness that ran deeper than the moment, as if every loss, no matter how small, carried the weight of all the ones before. We'll fix it, she said, her voice steady. There's got to be a way. Thatcher shook his head, his jaw tight. Takes tools I don't have, parts I can't get without a trip to Tucson. That's days away, maybe weeks. He turned, his eyes meeting hers, and for a moment, she saw something raw. Fear, not of the windmill, but of failing her, of watching another piece of this place slip away. Iris didn't look away. Then we start with what we've got, she said. There's wood in the shed, rope, Maybe we can brace it, get it turning enough to pull water. He studied her, his brow furrowing, then nodded. All right, let's try. They worked through the morning side by side, their hands brushing as they hauled splintered beams and tied ropes to steady the windmill's frame. Iris's dress was streaked with dirt, her hairpin slipping loose, but she didn't care. Thatcher's shirt clung to his back, sweat beading on his brow, but he didn't stop. They spoke little, their communication a silent dance of shared purpose, her passing him a nail, him steadying a plank as she hammered. By noon, the windmill stood patched, not whole, but spinning slowly, pulling just enough water to fill a bucket. They stood back, breathless, the bucket between them. Bucket. Iris laughed, a bright, unguarded sound that made Thatcher pause. We did it, she said, her eyes shining. You did it, he corrected, his voice soft. He reached out, almost instinctively, and brushed a smudge of dirt from her cheek. His hand lingered a moment too long, and Iris felt her breath catch, her heart racing under the weight of his touch. Their eyes locked, and for a heartbeat the world was just them. The windmill creaking, the water dripping, the sun warm on their faces. Then Thatcher pulled back, clearing his throat. I'll check the well, he muttered, turning away. Iris nodded, her cheeks flushed, and returned to the house, her fingers brushing the hairpin as if to ground herself. That evening, as she stirred the squash stew, Thatcher sat on the porch, his map forgotten. He spoke, his voice carrying through the open door. I didn't think I'd care about fixing things again, he said almost to himself. Not the windmill, not the house, not anything, but you. You make it feel like it matters. Iris paused, the ladle still in her hand. She stepped to the doorway, her silhouette framed by the lamplight. It does matter, she said softly. Not just the fixing, the staying. He looked at her then, really looked, and she saw something new in his eyes. Not just recognition, but longing, the kind that comes from years of holding back. Staying's hard, he said. Harder than leaving. I know, she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. But I'm still here. The silence that followed was warm, heavy with unspoken truths. Iris returned to the kitchen, her heart full, and Thatcher stayed on the porch, his gaze on the stars, as if searching for a way to say what he felt without breaking it. As the night deepened, Iris opened her journal and wrote, Today we saved the garden. Today I think we saved a little of ourselves too. She closed the book, her fingers lingering on the leather, and looked out the window at the windmill, its patched blades turning slowly in the moonlight. What would it take for two souls, tethered by shared scars, to choose each other over the safety of solitude? The Arizona autumn settled over the homestead like a soft blanket, its golden light filtering through cottonwood leaves that rustled with every breeze. The garden Iris McKe had nurtured now bloomed with abundance, squash heavy on their vines, herbs fragrant in their clay pots, and a cluster of wild sunflowers swaying tall, their yellow petals catching the sun like sparks. Iris stood among them, her gray muslin dress replaced by a new one, soft blue, a gift from Thatcher, its collar embroidered with tiny stars. Her chestnut curls were pinned with the wooden hairpin he'd carved, and her storm cloud eyes held a quiet radiance, as if she'd finally found the reflection of her own worth. Inside the adobe house, the kitchen was warm with the scent of apple pie, made from fruit traded at Willow Creek's autumn fair. The patchwork quilt draped over Thatcher's chair was joined by a new cushion stitched by Iris in the evenings, its fabric a patchwork of their shared moments. A scrap from her old apron, a piece of his worn shirt, a strip of calico from the peddler's cart. Thatcher sat at the table, his blue cotton shirt clean and pressed, his hands no longer restless but steady, holding a small wooden box he'd been carving, a gift for Iris, though he hadn't yet found the courage to give it. The past weeks had woven Iris and Thatcher closer, not through grand gestures but through the quiet language of presence. He'd started joining her in the garden, his hands learning the rhythm of planting, his laughter, rare but deep, echoing when she teased him about his uneven rows. She'd begun reading to him at night, her voice soft as she shared passages from a borrowed book of poetry, and he listened, his eyes tracing her face as if memorizing every line. Their silences were no longer walls but bridges, built from shared glances, brushed hands, and the unspoken understanding that they were both learning to stay. But the peace was tested one crisp morning when a letter arrived, delivered by the same peddler who'd brought Iris's squash seeds months ago. It was addressed to her, the handwriting sharp and unfamiliar. She opened it in the kitchen, her fingers trembling as she read. The saloon owner from Colorado had dropped his claim, but only because he'd found another target for his lies. The letter was a warning. He'd spread word in Tucson, painting her as a thief, a wanderer not to be trusted. Iris's heart sank, the old fear rising like a tide. She'd built something here, but could it withstand the weight of whispers? She found Thatcher by the windmill, now fully repaired, its blades turning smoothly in the breeze. "This came," she said, holding out the letter, her voice steady but thin. "It's about Colorado. The rumors, they're spreading." Thatcher took the letter, his eyes scanning the words. His jaw tightened, but when he looked at her there was no doubt, only a fierce clarity. "Let them talk," he said. "They don't know you, I do." Iris blinked, her throat tight. "What if it hurts you? This place, people in town, they'll judge." He stepped closer, his voice low and sure. "I've spent years caring what people think, Iris. Lost Clara because I was too stubborn to take her to a doctor in time. Lost myself after that. But you've made this place a home again. I'm not losing you to some coward's lies." She looked up at him, her eyes searching his, and saw something she hadn't dared to name. Love. Not the fleeting kind, but the kind that grows in the cracks of broken things, patient and unyielding. "I don't want to run anymore," she whispered. "But I'm scared." Thatcher reached for her hand, his calloused fingers warm against hers. "Then don't run. Stay. We'll face it together." The moment hung between them, fragile and perfect, like a sunflower seed caught in the wind. Iris nodded, her fingers tightening around his, and for the first time, she felt not just seen, but chosen. They stood there, the windmill creaking softly, the garden blooming at their feet, and the world felt smaller, kinder, as if it had carved out a space just for them. That evening, they attended Willow Creek's autumn fair, a rare outing that felt like a declaration. Iris wore her blue dress, the wooden hairpin gleaming in her curls, and Thatcher walked beside her, his arm brushing hers. The townsfolk noticed, some whispered, some smiled, but when the preacher's wife offered Iris a basket of apples and a warm nod, Iris felt a weight lift. Thatcher introduced her simply. "This is Iris, she's home now." The words were quiet, but they carried the strength of a vow. Back at the homestead, under a sky ablaze with stars, Iris and Thatcher sat on a new bench he'd built by the garden, its wood sanded smooth. He handed her the carved box, his hands steady but his voice hesitant. "Open it," he said. Inside was a silver brooch, shaped like a sunflower, its petals catching the moonlight. "It's not much," he began, but Iris stopped him, her fingers closing around the brooch. "It's everything," she said, her voice thick with emotion. She leaned forward, and he met her halfway, their lips brushing in a kiss that felt like coming home, not to a place, but to each other. The wind carried the scent of sunflowers, and the stars watched, silent witnesses to a love that had grown where nothing else could. Iris opened her journal that night, her final entry simple. "I am home, not in the earth, not in the house, but in his heart and mine." She closed the book, placed the brooch beside it, and looked out at the garden, its sunflowers standing tall, a reminder that even the smallest seeds could bloom in the right hands. The seasons turned. Iris and Thatcher built a life together, not with promises of forever, but with the daily choice to stay, to plant, to love. The homestead became a beacon, not just for them, but for others, a place where broken things could mend, where silence could sing. The story of Iris and Thatcher reflects the resilience of countless women and men in the late 19th century American West, a time when survival demanded not just physical strength but emotional courage. Women like Iris, often overlooked in historical narratives, played vital roles in shaping homesteads and communities. Their quiet labor, cooking, gardening, mending, transforming harsh landscapes into homes. The sunflower, a recurring symbol in this tale, was a common crop in the West, valued for its hardiness and beauty, much like the people who planted it. For fans of romantic literature, this story echoes the themes of authors like Willa Cather, whose novels celebrate the understated strength of those who find love and purpose in adversity. To learn more, consider exploring Cather's O Pioneers, or visiting historical sites like Arizona's Pioneer Museum, where the stories of homesteaders come to life. What seeds will you plant in your own life, and what will they grow to become? Thank you for joining us on this journey through Whispers on the Wind. If Iris and Thatcher's story touched your heart, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more tales of love, history, and resilience. Share your thoughts in the comments. Did you relate to Iris's courage or Thatcher's redemption? And don't forget to tap the bell icon so you never miss a new story. Let's keep planting seeds of inspiration together.